you all to the second in our Visiting Writers series as part of the Writers at Work unit in the Masters of Creative Writing at the University of Sydney. It's great to have you all here. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Garigal people of the unceded lands in the northeastern part of Sydney, where I'm fortunate to live and work. And I extend my acknowledgement and respect to the peoples of the lands that you're all joining us from. And I believe many overseas and your own First Peoples. I'm very pleased to have Beth Yahp joining us tonight, who we all know as the coordinator of the Creative Writing Program here at Sydney, and as a very much appreciated teacher, writer, colleague, and friend. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you.
So to introduce Beth to you, if she needs further introduction, her fiction and creative non-fiction include The Red Pearl and Other Stories, a memoir, Eat First, Talk Later, which was shortlisted for the 2018 Adelaide Festival Award for Literature, and a prize-winning novel, The Crocodile Fury, among many other works. For this event in the Writers at Work series, Writing, Activism and Ethics, Part 2, I'm interested in the ways in which Beth's work reflects on the ethics of writing the lives of others, the status of reading and writing amid forms of precarity, and scales of encounter in writing, large and small. We'll also hear some readings, and I will make space for audience questions. So please do feel free to start adding these to the chat as we go along, so I can get a sense of how much room to leave. You don't want to hear from me for the whole hour. So welcome, Beth. It's really lovely. I was saying to my students, it's wonderful to have the space to consider your work. It seems as though we would spend all of our time doing this, but we spend most of our conversations talking about other things. So it's great to have you here and to be able to think about your work in detail. So before we launch into the questions, I thought we might begin with a reading, if that's all right. So to introduce this reading to the audience, you wrote an essay on Julie Coe, who I believe is here. I have seen, hello Julie, in my collection, Reading Like an Australian Writer. Your essay is entitled 10 Thoughts on Fiction That Slays, Reading Julie Coe's Satire in a Post-Truth Pandemic. So I thought perhaps if you could just open with the first two sections of the essay for us.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Belinda, for that great introduction. And hi, everyone. I've been trying to write in chat to say hello to everyone, but I haven't been able to do it. It's so great to see. I invited all my friends and students and everyone whom I haven't seen for so long, because, you know, it feels like we're so separated. So it's really nice to see your faces here. And your names. So I'm zooming in from unceded Gadigal country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, I'm gonna find that essay. I was running around earlier trying to find the book and I couldn't find it, which is very surprising because the flat is small and I don't know where the books go. Okay, so in a year of fire, flood, and plague, followed by forced immobility, birdsong filling our suburban skies instead of aeroplanes, the yearning for movement grows in me. I look out the window at the stunted cabbage tree and potted jade plants in the corner of the balcony, where a fledgling butcherbird holds court, eyeing me through the window's glass, its only subject. It's brown tinged, fluffy as a puppy, but with a fierce jet eye as murderous as the hook that will sharpen on the end of its upper bill. I know the grown butcherbird is lethal, and what's more, impales its prey on sticks or hangs it in the forks of trees. Its cocked head is slightly mocking, its pointed gaze daring me to exit my glass cage. Come on, let's tussle. Looking out past my two screens in between Zoom classes and meetings, I think of Julie Coe's portable curiosities, both the title of her 2016 book and a traveling exhibition of crazy old mimes in one of her stories. These portable curiosities are the very last of their kind, dressed only in nappies as they continue to passionately perform their almost extinct humanist or artistic professions, historian, glass artist, in black boxes where they're kept with peepholes for the curious. Coe's stories are described as satirical as well as absurdist, bleak, and blackly comic, and Coe, the author, as not pulling any punches, weaving elements of the mysterious and the grotesque with the all too real. The portable curiosities in her story, Satyrus Rising, are billed as a public warning against irrelevance. Alarmingly, Coe's story foretells the nose-diving trajectory of our already diminished state of the arts and humanities in Australia in 2020. The arts, like universities and other precarity-fueled industries, riven not just by a pandemic, but by a government's ideological agenda under cover of a pandemic. The butcherbird's call when it comes is enchanting and musical, interspersed with harsher notes. 2, I'm having trouble reading these days. I'm having trouble teaching, trying to inspire my writing students in their own reading and writing, when all I see of them are their mostly blacked out boxes in my Zoom window. I'm never sure if they're actually there. It goes without saying that I'm having trouble writing myself, but I know by now this is something perennial, coming and going like the seasons, like the baby butcherbirds and rosellas and the occasional kookaburra that goes off like an alarm at 5 a.m. Yet in 2020, even the seasons seem unreliable. Is the challenge to do with trying to read and write in this year of disruption of biblical proportions, or is it trying to do so at a time when writers and readers, like artists and universities, have been officially designated inessential? No emergency job keeper to keep us in our jobs. Instead, we get a 1-2 punch to the gut of a massive fee hike for our arts and humanities students, future readers and writers, translators, lawyers, glass and performance artists, historians. My brain can't take in the scale of 3 billion terrestrial vertebrates wiped out over the recent Black Summer fires that now seem so long ago, or the 1.5 million humans dead worldwide from COVID-19 and counting, after months of hand washing, mask wearing, and hunkering down in the home office, aka bedroom. It feels like time itself is infected and scale gone wonky, its symptom. Everything seems simultaneously too fast and too slow, too big and too small, with no rabbit hole, magic potion, or looking glass needed to enter into the space of entrapment and excitation.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Beth. What a way to open. So this essay, I think we've got a decent picture of it, but for the audience, it's a collection of thoughts on the stories of Julie Coe, read through the lens of what was, at the time of writing, a fresh encounter with the pandemic. It's very noisy here. In the essay, you're reading as a writer, but you're doing so at a particularly fraught and bewildering moment in global history. How does reading become a lens at such times, do you think? And what kind of lens?
I guess it's funny reading it then, I was very aware that I was calling Julie Coe. I wanted to call her Julie. And I mean, the kind of practices of writing and reading, you know, force us into certain stances, you know, so, I mean, filter is a good way to think about it. And I think, you know, for me, reading does place a kind of filter over the world, you know, the comfort of known outcomes, perhaps, you know, or of disappearing into somebody else's drama, you know, and in high stress situations like the ones that we're in, and the one, you know, that was just beginning when I was writing about Julie Coe's work, you know, your own drama, collective or personal, kind of takes over. And it's hard to tear yourself away in such times from reality. I mean, the kind of drama of reality takes over the way, we become, I became addicted to watching the news and hearing this abundance of bad news repeating over and over again. It's the kind of reality carries all of the dramatic tension and plot turns that the best fiction does. And so fiction actually has to do something different in that time, I think. And I felt that way. And for me, it was characterized by being unable to read very much. And having to, I was already going small before that, but, at that time, it sort of seemed like we needed something else than what was being enacted. So reading Julie Ko at that time was what was bearable, I think, for me. Reading Satire felt like an antidote to increasingly extreme but static times, so characterized by immobility of both body and mind. So read for comfort, but at the same time, I also read for extremes, so it's almost as though things are so extreme, we need a more extreme lens to place over what we're experiencing, So the other thing, besides reading the what does Julie call it? The fiction that slays, which is how her fiction has been described. And I think Julie also describes it as that. Is the actual, watching zombie flicks is what my other go-to was, I needed that kind of extreme violence that rather than a more hidden structural violence that was being enacted constantly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Beth, that when all this hit us at the beginning, I found it difficult. I am generally a reader of realism, mostly. And realism seemed beside the point all of a sudden. It didn't seem to be doing the job. I couldn't quite engage. It seemed out of date as well, in a way that I think this work doesn't. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about satire and this kind of dark laughter that you refer to in this essay. Is it escape? What is it, this kind of response?
I think there's a real dissonance, isn't there, between the real that we're experiencing and what realism does, which actually makes us think more deeply, I think, about, the function of realism, and the kind of what we are supposed to accept as the real, which is actually a kind of project, the kind of realist project, a depiction of a certain kind of society, rising out of the rise of bourgeois society. And in our time capturing, the kind of almost hysterical fictions of, late, why isn't it dead yet, consumerist capitalism. So I guess satire is a kind of escape, although I'm not sure that I would call it that. But I think for me, I found realist work very hard to read because it sort of seemed like realism hurt too much. It didn't do what it was supposed to do, which reflect the kind of logics of the world that we live in ways that, we could embody, or there was a real kind of dissonance between what was felt of the world that we live in and what was represented in realist text. And that's an oversimplification, simplification, of course. But, what I really liked about Julie's satire is that, and Julie describes her writing as a kind of consolation. And I really kind of felt that. It's the consolation of being, of having your weirdnesses recognized, having the weirdness of the world, of being inessential, basically, And so Satyrus Rising, which is the story I'm talking about in that essay, is about it's about, the dying out of all the artists and humanists, and to the point where there is one left, and the one left is collected and put into a collection for display. You know, and so much of what happened, you know, at the beginning of last year, and a kind of abandonment of the arts. And I mean, you know, we just heard 2 days ago that 40,000 jobs have been lost in universities, you know, in the last 18 months. How many more in the performing arts? You know, so the comfort of satire, I guess, is that, you know, it spins the craziness in a different direction and allows you to kind of laugh, you know, break out into that kind of crazy laughter that one does, otherwise one would be crying, you know. And it's also a kind of rebuke against the system that dehumanizes, you know. So if you think about what satire, you know, is defined as doing, you know, it's a way of criticizing people or ideas in a humorous way, but with a kind of pedagogical object to teach something, or to, you know, hoping for some other different outcome. You know, and there's no saying what that project is. Maybe Julie could say something. I promise not to do that, Julie, sorry. But I guess, you know, what I found with, you know, reading satire at this time, and, you know, watching Colbert and Mikhailov, you know, was also a great comfort, is that the kind of, you know, that there was more of a conjunction with what I was feeling and those kind of crazy worlds that were being portrayed.
Yeah, and laughter feels like a form of resistance sometimes too. If we're laughing, we're still human and not quite crushed. You know, it feels like some assertion of humanity in the face of dehumanizing systems.
What is it? Something escapes you with the breath? You know, maybe it's something about the humors, you know, these humors that are running rampant around. I know that's an old way of thinking about the body, but it's also the kind of Chinese, you know, the meridians and these energy pathways that are running around in one. And maybe sometimes, you know, laughter actually allows, you know, the propulsion of that energy outside of ourselves when that energy, you know, is overheated. Yeah,
it's got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm hoping that you could read a short section a little further along in the essay. It's on page 311 from "In These Lockdown Times," just to the end of that section.
In these lockdown times, I'm uncertain about most things: the weather, the seasons, my job, my writing, whether I'll be able to go out tomorrow or shake hands, when I'll see my family again. But having worked with thousands of new or experienced writers and readers, the latest via Zoom, I know one thing for certain, that the challenge is ethical. It's about having the capacity to make an ethical call, one founded in care and deliberation. It's not about writers or satirists or even trolls needing to be censored, cancelled, imprisoned, stowed away in black boxes as warnings, or killed. Instead, it's about readers reading in ways that aren't instrumentalist or unassailably aligned. It's about readers being able to think and feel two things at once, as fiction encourages, without their acting rashly upon those thoughts and feelings. It's about risk and movement. As Maria Tumarkin writes about writers like Julie Ko, to think is to keep moving and doubting, to risk rolling down a hill. In other words, for the writers on the outside who keep on moving, the risks, personal, professional, are always profound. The challenge is to become readers who are prepared to take profound risks too. It's readers, young or new readers especially, being given the space, support, and capacity to read uphill against their own feelings and beliefs. It's what the arts and the humanities equip us to do.
Thank you, Beth. I love that phrase, reading uphill. One of my students just brought it up in a presentation, and it is memorable and does exactly what you want a phrase to do. But the phrase that I wanted to ask you about here is this one. It's about risk and movement. Can you tell us more about that, about risk and movement in writing?
I guess it's an argument against rigidity in writing, but also in thinking and in being. And, you know, for me, that's you know, the ethical actually calls into presence questions about this movement, questions about relationality, you know, of thinking in relationship, of self to others, of one power structure to another, you know. So immediately, if we're thinking about relationality, you know, rhizomatic perhaps, you know, rather than hierarchical, stacked, but, you know, spreading out, immediately, you know, we think in movement in that way. And you know, you're not only situated on one point on a map, you know, as Doreen Massey speaks about in her book For Space, you know, that ways of reading maps become different if we think about this relationality. So, you know, and that, for me, that movement actually, you know, it's something about thinking of ourselves, you know, as writers, but also as people who exist within those relationships, rather than thinking of ourselves as self-determined, you know, or trapped in the skin of me, bound by what P.J. Eakin in Relational Selves called the myth of autonomy, you know. So we do have this very kind of strong, powerful myth of the self as being, you know, discrete. And I think what Maria Tamarkin, you know, certainly does for me when she talks about these, you know, kind of movement as being something that diverse, you know, I mean, that quote that I give from Maria Tamarkin is from an essay called Not Just Another Diversity Panel, you know, for, and about clumping of certain, you know, types together, but thinking about the spaces between the types. And I think that is an ethical project, you know, so which kind of actually takes the definition of ethics outside of the dictionary definition, you know, so kind of defined as, you know, the study or the kind of positioning or the giving of importance to what is morally right or wrong, you know, so a set of beliefs. But, you know, if we think about ethics as being relational, then it comes out of rigid categorizations into something that actually has more vibrancy, you know, is not static. Yeah, so that, and for me, that notion of coming out of a static rigidity into movement actually is very promising, you know, that then you can also think about systems and notions of selfhood or existing structures as also being able to be troubled and you know, able to move.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, it's given me so much to think about. And I'm thinking about that idea that that we have to believe that systems can be changed. We have to act as though, there's a quote somewhere, I can't remember who it is, we have to act as though systems can be overturned. Because what else is there? We have to act like that every day, as though we can change these things. And this takes me into my next question nicely too. So this essay is a wonderful example of a critical creative hybrid, which is very useful for me because I have just been trying to talk about such things to our classes. The opening that you read at the beginning of our talk takes in various scales. It zooms in from a year of fire, flood and plague to your own location at home, looking out at the butcher bird on the balcony with his fierce jet eye and the hook of his bill. So I wanted to ask you what belongs in an essay, what can it accommodate, and what does it do to shift scales in this way?
I think everything and anything belongs in an essay. And I don't think I said that. I think it was Montaigne, that great essay writer. And it's to do with the French root of the word essayer, to try or to test something. So the essay for me is a place of experiment in what can be written about, but also in form, so then the task of any writer is always to find the best form capable of holding whatever substance you fill it with. That's best expressed by that form. So essays have certain forms, and certainly, like within an academic institution, we know the form of the academic essay, has strict proportions, which are very elegant, but for, the lyric essay brings something else into this space. And I think certainly, for me, that the essay is something through something that kind of shows its thinking, so you can actually follow the thinking, the thinking that threads through as, the essay writer looks at something else, or tries to work out something that, might be very difficult to work out. So in terms of scales, it's true, one of the, probably I was writing about scales. So that was an actual butcher bird, by the way. And I remember sending Belinda a photograph of it, because it was really, I'm at my desk that I normally sit at now with this big window and a balcony outside. And that bird used to come in and just like, it was like it was the dueling of the gazers. And I don't think I won, but it fit in very much with me thinking about the gaze, and what we were looking at in this time and what we were feeling, so that people were kind of constrained as we are now, to our little boxes, while something so huge was happening outside. We were increasingly being diminished. It felt like, so, it felt like these two scales were actually existent on the same plane. This kind of crazy time where really it was like you had gone through the looking glass. Everything was impossible and ridiculous and also murderous. We would lose our heads at any time. So none of the rules of time or space seemed to apply. And I guess I was trying to represent that on the page to kind of create a kind of instability in the reader that perhaps might mirror what other people were feeling at this time. But then the structure of that essay also is about this instability anchored by the number 10, so the thinking, 10 thoughts actually constrains and anchors thoughts that would otherwise run in all directions and kind of eat themselves up, which is how I felt, the times kind of seemed to me my thoughts were doing that. So it really was about, the constraining form, but also then having to find ways to say things within a particular constraint.
Thank you. I could stay on that for quite a long time, but I'm going to move us rudely onto your memoir, because I don't want to not have discussed it. So your memoir, I will describe it from the back cover. In this dazzling memoir, Beth persuades her aging parents on a road trip around their former home, Malaysia. She intends to retrace their honeymoon of 45 years before, but their journey doesn't quite work out as she planned. Only the family mantra, eat first, talk later, keeps them and perhaps the country from falling apart. Around them, corruption, censorship of the media, detentions without trial, and deaths in custody continue. It's a book about how we tell family and national stories, about love and betrayal, home and belonging, and about the joys of food. So I wondered if you could read from page 8, food and place, to the end of the section on the next page, if you would.
Food and place are intrinsically connected in our family's history. There's a story of something to eat for every occasion. Our food map lies across the map of the actual landscape, a sensual overlay that's tenuous yet resilient, and we follow its invisible roots assiduously. Here you were born. 2 streets away was the biryani stall where your mother had lunch every day she was pregnant. She threw up every other kind of food. The owner was so proud. He claimed you'd come out Indian Muslim. There is your old school. Wow. Is the Chendal man still there on the corner? Yeah, looks like him, but how can? He looks exactly the same. Maybe eat Chendal every day, no need fountain of youth. Must be his son lah. Good Chendal genes. Turn right, turn right, turn right lah. I tell you, it's just over there, around the corner. Best char kway teow in town. This is torture, by the way, Belinda.
Sorry.
Char kway teow. Remember, we went there every Sunday after church. No siham for you, clams, but extra chili. No need to tell. The man knew our order by heart. Now you've missed the turning. Now we have to go a big round to come back. Never mind lah. This way got the best salt and pepper spare ribs in town. Every place we plan to visit on this trip, that I plan to visit, is tied to what happened there, just as what happened is tied to our stories, is tied in our stories to what we could eat. Maybe that's because our family story is not one of great events, of heart-rending tragedy or near miraculous triumphs over adversity. It's not the story of the grand march of history overtaking and testing individuals, bringing out the best or worst in them, and neither is it one of forced labor or physical abuse, famine or starvation, even though it takes place in the colonial and post-colonial third world where such things happened. Some of us were hungry. Some of us wore threadbare clothes. Many of us counted our 20-cent coins, others their $100 bills. People lived, loved, fell out, disappeared, stewed, found each other, forgave, or didn't. People died. My mother Mara's brother in Changi, my father Peter's grandmother from drinking weed killer, my Siamese grandmother from old age, calling out to Mara in a faraway country, using Mara's childhood nickname, Payao, Payao. Nobody on either side of our family was killed, as far as I know. Nobody murdered or was murdered.
Thank you, Beth. Yes, the earlier part of that reading was a sort of an exquisite torture that I didn't consider our distance from these foods. Could you tell us a bit about the writing of this memoir and what was important to you to encompass or convey in the narrative?
It's really interesting. When I had a look at that summary earlier, and as I read it out now, my first thought as I was reading it was, this is not true. That summary is not true. And I don't know what it is about. And in fact, a lot of my work now beyond, this memoir that actually marks a particular time and understanding, that I as the memoirist had at that time. And things have moved on since then, and a lot of the other work, the work after is about kind of examining the interstices that happen within that summary. So trying to, the interstices of nothing happened, what goes on there in that space. So in terms of writing this book and what I was trying to convey with that narrative, it was also something about scale, so setting the kind of personal story, the family story against the grand, mythical grand narrative of nation. So I was trying to tell an alternative history of Malaysia through the experiences of my parents. And their lives, kind of spanned most of the major events of the 20th century, from depression to colonialism, the end of colonialism to war, the communist emergency, independence, the financial crisis of the late 1990s, the Reformasi movement and jailing of Anwar Ibrahim, and for them, the leaving of their children to study overseas, which is a kind of very usual story for Malaysian children. So it was, I call it a fictional memoir because a lot of things were fictionalized in it, while a lot of things did happen. But I guess, the thing I was trying to capture was, what happens when you juxtapose something as small as somebody wanting to eat char kway teow and not being able to at a particular moment, or somebody making yong tau fu, a kind of tofu dish, against, a larger history of incarceration, in new villages. And that movement, what happens in that space between the small and the large is, for me, a very kind of productive, often quite painful space as well, because within that space resides all of the silences and the things that, could not be spoken when I was asking my parents questions about their stories, and still cannot be spoken.
The title seems to me so resonant on that question. I was wondering whether it came to you early or whether it was sort of a stroke of genius, if you don't mind me calling it that, later. It's one of my favorite titles of a memoir, because of the ways it suggests the unspoken, but it also suggests warmth and community at the same time as a kind of hush, not now. And I was wondering, did you always have that title?
No. So this book came out of, some of you might be interested in to hear this. It was my thesis for my doctorate. And it was actually, so this is quite good to hear, not so good in our times where, you are being pressured to finish in 3 years, right? So I took longer and I had 2 failures, so I actually wrote 3 books, and substantial, amounts of those books, by the time I got to the point where I realized and, decided that this wasn't working, I have to start again. So it's a matter of like going somewhere, then going back, so it had an earlier title because I was doing 2 things at the time with this research. I was researching my family story, but I was also in Malaysia a lot, and, having returned to Malaysia from Paris, where I was living for a while. And I was trying my hand at gonzo journalism, so I was writing about the activists, my friends who were activists, who actually many of them had, started out at the SRC, Sydney University Student Rep Council, ratbags there, who then went back to Malaysia, and became journalists and politicians and non-government activists, human rights activists. So one of the strands was my family, and the other strand was documenting this work, within the Reformasi movement, to try and overthrow, this authoritarian government that had been in power since independence in 1957. So the kind of, so that the title, the original title of the first work that I abandoned was this gonzo journalist kind of piece of writing called something like, or was it A Girl's Own Election Adventure in Malaysia? It was so descriptive. And it felt like that. It was like a girl's own, as opposed to a boy's own adventure, rediscovering my country, actually, with the help of my friends who took me lots of places to eat. So Eat First, Talk Later is a phrase that, many, if not all, Malaysians will recognize. there's always this, Alison, I can see you smiling. There's a saying always like, eat first, makan dulu. And it's a kind of importance placed on eating. So that you talk, you don't actually kind of, I'm speaking in generalizations now as well, because my family talked and argued over our meals, but not at my grandmother's place, actually. So that's where the title came from.
It's fantastic. We might think a bit about the question of writing about the lives of others. So I think that all writers of family stories and people who write about their friends have to make decisions about how they manage that responsibility, and perhaps develop a code for themselves for dealing with those questions arising from the complexities of memory and privacy. I wondered if you could share your thoughts on this. I feel like it's something that you must have thought about and returned to a lot while writing this book.
Yes. It's always tough writing about live people, actual people, who have their own stories and their own versions. I think when I was writing it, I didn't show it to anybody, so it was something that I talked about, but I never showed it to anybody who was in it. And there was quite a specific reason for that, because I think it would have had to be something else if I'd done that in the stages when it was being made and it was unformed and it needed to fail and it needed to say things which I could take out of a final version, so that wasn't exactly me thinking about the privacy of others, but it was actually thinking about the privacy of the text as it's being made, which for me, it couldn't have survived. It was so fragile. It couldn't have survived, the kinds of requests that I had when I did show it, So I had, on the one hand, when I did show it to my parents and my sisters and my partner, they all responded in different ways. So I had to change names, for example, when the book was published. I had to change certain events. And there were things that I was happy to do, but some things that I was asked to change, I just couldn't change because they would have irrevocably changed the story. So for example, my father wanted me to change the fact that my mom was actually born in Bangkok and was undocumented. So she was brought to Malaysia as a child, to Malaya as a child. She was adopted into a family, and there's a long story about that, why that happened. But so she came to, Malaysia, and her birth certificate, was lost. And so when Malaysia got independence, they put her down as having been born in Malaysia as a way for her to get a passport, get documentation. So she's always had this, and she's had different ages as well, because the age that she was given is older than she says she is. And we don't know. She looks very young, So there was always this kind of blurriness about her origins. And so my dad, in the book, I say she was born in Bangkok and she was brought to Malaysia at this age, but my dad said, if you do that, so by this stage they had emigrated to Hawaii, and they're in their like 80s, late 70s, 80s at the time. And my dad said, you have to not say she was born in Bangkok, because, if you do, she's going to have her passport revoked, her Malaysian passport revoked, and immigration will come and look for her in Hawaii, and they'll take her to a detention center for undocumented migrants. And this was causing huge anxiety, in my parents. And I remember them telling me that, and me thinking, okay, the chances of that happening to people at that age, are not likely. But at the same time, the kind of fear of that happening is very, very real for people who have had experiences of, you know, I mean, he grew up in a new village, which was a kind of, you know, a detention camp for Chinese during the Malayan communist emergency, you know, so he kind of knew what that was like. But I couldn't change that, you know, so in the end, I had to say it, because otherwise her story would have been completely different and completely not true, you know, if I made her into a Malaysian. And, you know, the whole kind of Thai side of her is so kind of prominent. So yeah, so kind of issues like that came up. And I guess you have to, you know, for me, I had to really kind of think about, you know, what the story itself and the text was trying to document and what it was trying to do versus the kind of feelings that were involved in people, you know, very close to me being extremely upset by this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the answer is, you know, I mean, I made a certain decision. Some things that I have published earlier have also resulted in quite, you know, terrible fallouts. And, you know, if I could go back and change like an earlier work that I published in my 20s, I would, you know, I would now, rather than having published it, because of all the kind of, you know, pain it caused.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. And I have found, I won't go into it, but I've found writing fiction doesn't get you off the hook either.
No.
That's not, people see what they see, and, you know, often based on sort of real enough things to make that connection. And so it's a question that we're all asking ourselves, I think.
Yeah, I think you get into trouble for the stories that you do tell, some of the stories you do tell, you know, so it's a kind of, I mean, one way to think about it is that even if you're writing memoir, you know, as much as fiction, it's a construction. You know, we make a choice, this story, not that story, this anecdote, not that anecdote, this sensation, not another, you know, and the, you know, sometimes people get angry with you and really upset for not being included. You know, so I remember in this earlier story that I was talking about called Sisters that I published in my 20s, and it was a commission and I needed the money, and so I published it, you know, and I remember I didn't have enough words. There weren't enough words in the story for me to include all my sisters. So I've got 3 sisters, and it was about 2 pairs of sisters. So it was about my mom and her sisters. And then it was about me and my older sister, who I think is actually here. So Amy, you can say that's wrong. And, so I kind of included Amy and, you know, and so these 2 pairs of sisters, but I didn't have enough words to talk about my other sisters. And so what I did, you know, narrator's choice, I declared it, I put them into a box and kept them under the stairs in that essay. I said, okay, here I've got 2 other sisters, but, you know, for now I can't talk about them. I'm going to put them in a box and they're under the stairs. And my sisters actually got upset at that, you know, at actually not being, you know, and I remember one of them saying to me, I don't think she's here, but saying, you know, why aren't I important enough to be written about? You know, so you can kind of go wrong either way, you know, and you really kind of have to call it in each, you know, with each instance, you're actually making those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you make mistakes that you never saw coming. I'm just seeing a question or 2 in the chat, so I'm going to invite the audience if they'd like to ask anything. We've been chattering on, we don't have a huge amount of time, but there's a question here from Jemima that says, hi Beth, in relation to what you said about your memoir, how do you deal with the knowledge that your understanding of a story or theme will change over time? Did you experience a gut feeling that told you to release your writing at a particular time? So that timeliness question.
That's a really good question, Jemima. I think, I mean, pieces of writing that are published are historical documents, so they come out of a particular time, even though they might seem timeless, or they might, subscribe to the illusion of timelessness. They are actually timely, they're kind of caught within particular times. So I mean, there are things I wish I could, I wish I hadn't published, but then the exigencies of publishing are quite great. That we have all sorts of pressures on us to publish. So I think actually starting from that point that you talk about, Jemima, that starting from the point that your understanding of a story or theme might change over time is actually quite a good starting point. That I understand this from this particular point in time, and a future me who is a different me, may have a different understanding, and then, the question that you ask yourself is, what is the work that can be done or needs to be done, between, in that kind of, that when I was talking earlier about relationality and the kind of relationships that exist between people or power structures, it's also a kind of relationship that exists between selves, so yourself at 20 and yourself at 60, is, there's quite a space, quite a thread, linked, but there's quite a difference between them. And I mean, I think, it's part of that thing about judging somebody at a particular moment. I mean, of course we do that, but it's kind of more interesting and generative to think about, okay, I make that judgment at that point in time, but that judgment is something that can be revised, so it comes back again to that notion of, writing and ethics being about kind of being against rigidity, against closeness, thinking about texts as closed, as Lynn Haginian, poet, said, that it's much more, we should perhaps kind of think of ourselves as kind of, open in ways that time fixes, but the writer moves on from that and should be allowed, the writer should be allowed revision. I don't mean that you're constantly revising your life, but I think the kind of that work of rethinking the fixities of what you have previously stated is actually pretty important work. Second edition, Philip. Yeah, no. No. Go somewhere else. It's also like, how many stories do we write, right? You find yourself kind of reliving, kind of rehashing, kind of, you probably have one main story, each of us is trying to tell or working out, the way to tell, and we always fail, so it's and sometimes it's that story, and finding different ways to enter into it, and the small differences, make it a different story, as well as the kind of difference in age of the writer.
I think it's one of the interesting things that happens when you've been writing for a while, that realization that you're always writing the same story, that you write these things and you read them and think, oh, here we are again. There was an image before we run out of time that I wanted to conjure from your memoir, because it was so arresting to me. Where you conjure a kind of typical scenario for meetings with your activist friends in Kuala Lumpur. And so you talk about meeting up with them and say, everyone will be talking and laughing, complaining and strategizing for hours, and I'll be listening. And I love that image of this kind of vitality and boisterousness and planning, this making things happen of the people around you, and then the writer somehow separate from those verbs and on their own little clause at the end of that sentence, I'll be listening. I wondered if you could say something there about the relationship of writing to activism, or the writer to activists that we're seeing in that image.
I think I'm kind of presenting maybe a slightly suspect dichotomy. And I was thinking about this actually, you know, because the kind of easy answer would be, yeah, you know, writers are people who notice, right? Writers are people who attend, who kind of cultivate attentiveness. That's what we do. And there is a kind of necessary separation between the noticers, you know, the ones who notice, and those who are actors, the ones who, you know, we write about, that we document. And I was thinking there's some, so we do that, you know, there is, you know, sometimes you actually need to kind of step out of the river there that Philip talked about, Custer, you know, step out of that river of life. And, you know, the time in which we write is also time lived, but it's time lived outside of the other things that are going on, you know, so you step into a different kind of river. That's one thing. And there's something there in there too about being a reader, you know, being, you know, I was called a born reader, you know, in my family, always having my head in a book and daydreaming and not really that interested in what was going on around me because there was this other life. You know, so you kind of spend time in life reading spaces too, and the actions, and, you know, in interpreting or not. But I think there is a kind of romanticization of the writer as being the outsider, the watcher, you know, the observer, more than the participant. And there's also, you know, for me, when I think about that in my memoir, that stance of the writer, you know, I have to say that there's something about the kind of cliche of the performance of being a writer involved there, you know, and, you know, listening to witness accounts when you're in the thick of things. And it's to, you know, it's a kind of technique that we need to engage in, the creation of a persona. You know, so in my case, the persona is the writer. The persona is also the essayist. The persona is the artist, whatever it is, but it is a persona, you know. So in that kind of me drawing attention to that is actually separating myself from everyone else, when actually I was in there, but in that persona, you know, kind of living that persona as well. Yeah, so it's a tool or a strategy. It's not you, but, you know, it's also you. So it's kind of two things at once. And I think, you know, in that book, I was trying to inhabit that space of being two things at once and kind of test the tensions that kind of become more acute in this space when you know, you're trying to do and be two things. Yeah, and what do I mean by that? So in my gonzo journalism efforts in gonzo journalism, you know, maybe it was actually kind of testing the unethical space, the unethical storytelling space, where tensions are trying to find the gold of a story actually take precedence over caring about whose point of view is represented. Yeah. That's a very long way of saying, Belinda, I don't know.
It occupies that kind of muddy space between doing and writing, the way we have to negotiate acting and thinking. And it was just a lovely little sort of flash in that image of that question. Okay, so we have reached just past the hour. I'm just cut and pasting into the chat an essay of Beth's from last year, I think, that if we had more time, I would have spoken about, that I want to commend to you to look at some of these questions of form and scale and how you think through the threads along with so the reader can accompany you. There were comments and questions I didn't get to in the chat. I apologize, and the recording will be up in our Canvas site and I suspect on YouTube, but I will let you know. Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to our audience. What a lovely, big, warm, friendly room we are in this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure to engage with your work, Beth. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And, you know, I can't overstress what a lovely way this is to spend an hour with such friendly faces. And yeah, thank you. And great questions, Belinda. That really kind of made me have to think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it's the wrong time of day for thinking. We should be eating right now.
we would be if we were doing this in person. Oh my God.
Yeah, we will again. Okay, well, thanks everybody and good night. Have a wonderful week and take care, Beth, and happy writing and reading to you.
Can I also just say a thank you for all the people who've zoomed in from the Philippines, from Malaysia, from Hawaii. Joanna, hi. You know, so people I haven't seen for such a long time, from Hawaii also. Yeah, so great to see all of you. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. All right, goodbye everybody. See you.
All right, bye.